I wanted to talk a little bit about stress and the devil. Now, about half the time in the New Testament, the devil is not referring to a person, but to a translation of something more along the lines of the adversary. It's more of a legal term, sort of like in a courtroom, it's your accuser. And Jesus is oftentimes portrayed as the advocate or someone who is defending you. And of course, what better lawyer to have defending you than the Son of God, the judge? You know, on a side note, Jesus says multiple times, I did not come to judge you. And it's funny that, he says, I didn't come to judge you, I came to save you. For the Son of Man came to save the world, not to judge the world, is the less known John 3:17 quote. We often know John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, that whoso believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. And a few times throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament, Jesus says, I didn't come to judge you. He tells the Pharisees that Moses is your accuser or your judge. And we all know that the laws of man we could never live up to because nobody's perfect. And we need to understand that as Christians or as any believer in God, we're not perfect and we can't be. But although we aren't perfect, it could be important to understand really how things can work, how our adversary can sometimes be ourselves. Our worst enemy sometimes can be a multitude of things: our anger, our stress, our depression, being overworked, giving too much of ourselves, even though it's a loving and generous thing we're trying to do. So we need to understand, how does stress work? How does it become our adversary? And how could we defend ourselves against it? Science now understands how stress works. And it doesn't mean that you are necessarily just stressed out at work. You can be stressed out in many ways. You could worry too much. You can treat your body badly by not eating well, by not exercising, by working too hard even though you mean well and want to do good for others. Even the best intentions can lead to stress. So what's the danger of stress? Well, the danger of stress is that if you let it get too far, if you allow yourself to get too depressed, which means to push down your feelings, it doesn't mean sadness, too angry, which would be the opposite, letting out your anger as opposed to holding it all in, there has to be a balance. Hateful, resentful, fearful, worried. There are a couple great quotes from some science fiction movies and books. One science fiction movie is Star Wars, where Yoda says, fear leads to the dark side. And we'll explain a little bit why that is really true. In the book Dune, which is turned into a movie, it says fear is the mind killer. And a lot of our stresses come from fear, worry, even some of our depression does. But then there are also things such as hatred, fear of others or people different than us, which can lead to hatred, jealousy, envy. But really, even just overworking ourselves and becoming overwhelmed, in addition to things like addiction, if we're honest, drug addiction, food addiction, alcohol addiction, what I'm proposing is that we begin to understand that these things will take you away from your ability to think straight. More important, whatever your value system is. As a Christian, your value system is to follow Christ, to follow the golden rule, to love others. Jesus says, love the Lord God with all thy heart, and love thy neighbor as thyself. And we can't do that if we're too overwhelmed or out of balance, too stressed, too angry, too depressed, or addicted, even if we mean well. So let me tell you a little bit about the science behind it. When you begin to get stressed out, your body goes into something they like to call fight or flight. Now, that's really a bad term because we don't fight or run away. Sometimes we can close or shut down. Sometimes we can withdraw into bad habits, or we can withdraw from our friends and family who could be there to support us. So another way of saying it is self-preservation mode. We do what we think will get us through the situation. Other people might call it fight, flight, or freeze. But this self-preservation mode is the result of high levels of stress, and it could be in some of the different forms I've mentioned. Now, what happens during that time is your body begins to release stress hormone. You might release adrenaline and the more popularly known stress hormone, cortisol. When you begin to release these things, in a sense, it's sort of like coffee. It gives you the boost to get through something difficult. The more common example they'll give in an extreme situation or in a primitive situation is you're about to be chased by a lion. Your body will shut down, your stomach will stop working, and your mind will stop working, and you'll just react. Your adrenaline and cortisol will flow and give you the energy you need to get through that situation, to escape. Now, what happens when you begin to release cortisol and stress hormone, or also known as stress hormone, as well as adrenaline, is the more you release, the less your prefrontal cortex will work. The part of your brain that is in charge of logic, reasoning, and thinking. For example, if you're going and facing a lion and about to run away, which we can argue, that's a whole other situation. Can you run away from a tiger? But if you're going to face danger, you can't spend time thinking. You can't spend time digesting. So your body sort of goes on autopilot. That's the self-preservation mode. And we live in a world today that is so full of stress, low levels and high levels of stress, depression, isolation, addiction, that even the best intentioned of us will fall prey to this. Now, levels of stress that are then followed by periods of rest and recovery actually make you stronger, like lifting weights. You lift weights, you rest, you recover, your muscles tore when you lifted the weights, and so they rebuild and you get stronger. Humans are very good at dealing with stress as long as the stress doesn't continue. Now, when the stress continues for prolonged periods of time, it starts to release these chemicals so often that it becomes a little bit toxic for our body. The psychologist Gabor Mate speaks about the fact that 86% of autoimmune diseases are from females, and he believes because they're taught in some ways not to express their anger, their frustration, but more importantly because they're caretakers for their children, for their family, and sometimes for the elderly as well. So exposing themselves to prolonged periods of stress will create an autoimmune response, which the body, trying to preserve itself or help itself, will begin to poison itself by having these chemicals in too much abundance or for too often. So essentially, if we want to oversimplify it, the more stressed out, angry, depressed, addicted we are, the less our ability to think occurs. Our brain begins to shut down, and more importantly, our value system. Think about when you're extremely angry. Do you have the moment there where you're going to think about what you're doing? No, you get anger and you express your anger. You might throw something or hit something or do something you would never do in that moment. You would say to yourself, well, after that moment, you would say to yourself, that's not really me, because it's not you. You see, when we have extreme anger or hatred or fear or depression or addiction, we no longer become ourselves, because the part of our brain that we would use to think and identify with our habits and thoughts normally shuts down. So this really makes it very, very important that we maintain balance and we practice balance in our lives, which again is so difficult for even the best of us. Because our adversary, or the devil, doesn't necessarily have to be an outward force. It could be the circumstances of our own stress, our own addiction, our own anger or hatred or fear. We have extreme cases of this. You could think of somebody who walks in on their wife who's cheating on them, and I read an article recently where a guy walked in on someone who he had already broken up with, and he found her with another man, and he shot the other man and killed him. We're not thinking in that moment. We're reacting. Our whole value system and what's important to us goes out the window. In many ways, so does our religion, what we believe in. We're not thinking about the consequences. We're not thinking about how this action will lead to another consequence and lead to another and another. We're not thinking these things through, and we can't. I think in a lot of ways during COVID time, I saw this happening all around me, with so many of us afraid, stressed out, overworked. As teachers, they were doing things online, and it was very exhausting if you were trying to give it your all. And you had fear and frustration and depression in many different areas. And it seemed like in many cases, adults cared about mental health and wanted the well-being of young people to be put first, but in many ways they were paralyzed and didn't know what to do and couldn't do or wouldn't do anything. I would also argue that many of our parents and people who are constantly working, constantly stressed, constantly trying to pay their bills, especially when they can't pay their bills. They can't see what's important, and they can't value what is normally to them valuable. Again, if you think of an extreme case, when you're being tortured, you no longer value being locked up forever if you confess to something you didn't really do. You can think of the extreme depression, where you don't value any longer things that are valuable to you, including most importantly, your own life. You stop valuing the most important thing to you, which is your own life. And some people commit or think of committing suicide. So what happens under extreme stress, depression, anger, addiction, we get overwhelmed, and it sort of hijacks our system. We're no longer ourselves. That's why it doesn't feel like we're being ourselves. It may feel like we're acting or behaving or thinking in a way that may be quote-unquote crazy. We have to watch out for this, because no matter how good of a Christian or Catholic or Muslim or Jew or any religion where you want to do what's right, where you want to be a good person, where you want to help others and put others first, those things are not possible when we're too stressed or when we're too overwhelmed. So think of the things that we say are important. Our kids are important. But we can't see what's good for them and what's good for ourselves, and we can't value them if we are too stressed out and overwhelmed. Think of God, and we want to put God first. We can't do that when we are too stressed or depressed or addicted or overwhelmed. Think of our family. Think of our own lives and our own health and our own well-being, let alone our community and our church and those around us who matter so much. When you're too stressed or depressed or angry or addicted, your value system goes out the window and gets destroyed or scrambled in varying degrees. And the more frequently it happens, and to the higher degree it happens, we become less and less and less able to see what's important and what matters. So this is very important that we take this to heart, and that we try to notice this for ourselves and for others, that we have an absolute duty to take care of ourselves. I've often found the most loving and giving people give to everyone else, but they don't keep any for themselves. I'm that way myself, and for years I struggled, especially after COVID, to take care of myself, to exercise, to eat well, to have good habits. It was very, very, very difficult. One thing that I changed in the last several weeks that has been working well is getting up earlier, which you would think would make me more tired. But I started to think, I give my best and the best of myself to others all day as a teacher and someone who cares and wants to do well. I need to give myself some of the best time that I have. Give myself some of the best of me first. And ironically, by getting up earlier, stretching a bit, doing a little bit of exercise before work, I have more energy and can give more to others. And I have more energy when I get home. Whereas before I did this, I would come home so exhausted. Ever since COVID, I didn't have anything in me to exercise, to do anything good for myself, and I ate horribly. My cholesterol went so high I almost had to go on medication. But luckily, I was able to get that under control. But I really wish I understood it sooner. When you're too stressed or addicted, and those other things I mentioned, your value system goes out the window, and what really should matter to you no longer matters. And this is an important adversary we face every single day. So take care of yourself and make it a priority, because what you care about, and what you believe in are all depending on it.